You were not supposed to be there. You know that now. You knew it then, somewhere beneath the part of your brain that was still making excuses, still reaching for explanations, still telling you that tired men see things at night near dark water. That part of you knew. It just did not want to be right. The rod was already set. The cooler was already open. And something in the black water of that lake was already watching you cast your line. His name was Marcus, 41 years old. Broad shoulders, calloused hands, a quiet man who had spent the better part of 2 decades turning the long, silent roads of Central Europe into something he understood. Something manageable. Truck driving had a reputation. The loneliness, the irregular sleep, the way the miles begin to blur together after a while. But Marcus had made peace with all of it long ago. He had simply built a life that fit inside a cab. He grew up outside Knoxville, Tennessee. His father had been a mechanic, his mother a school librarian, and somewhere between the two of them he had inherited a patience for things that required time. Engines, books, fish, especially fish. The hobby had started when he was 7. A creek behind his grandmother's property in rural East Tennessee, a cane pole, and an afternoon that stretched out long and golden and unhurried. He never forgot the feeling of it. The way time changed when you sat near moving water. The way the rest of the world seemed to agree to leave you alone. He had carried that with him everywhere. 2 fiberglass rods secured in a rack above the bunk. A small tackle box wedged into the overhead storage. A collapsible stool, a waterproof lantern, a mesh cooler that had been to more countries than most people he knew. His routes through Germany, the Czech Republic, Poland, northern Austria, they were not just freight corridors to him. They were a map of good water, lakes he had researched in advance, stretches of river where the regulations permitted a line, quiet places he could park the truck, walk a short distance, and remember what it felt like to be still. Kept him level. That was the word he always used. Level. He had been driving for 16 hours that week already when his tachograph told him to stop. The digital log was exact. He had a mandatory rest period coming, and no amount of willpower or coffee was going to override it. This was not an inconvenience. He had planned it. There was a lake he had found the previous autumn. A small, deep body of water sitting inside a fold of forested hills about a quarter mile from a secondary road in a remote stretch of countryside near the German-Austrian border. He had visited it twice before. Both times in daylight. Both times alone. The water was clear and cold, the banks were mostly rock and short grass, and on the far shore the tree line came down close and dark and undisturbed. No boat launches. No picnic markers. No signs of anyone else. He had mentioned it to no one. That was part of the appeal. It was late March. The kind of night where winter is technically over but has not yet agreed to leave. The air had a sharp, clean bite to it that he did not mind. He had dressed for it, thermals under his flannel, a thick canvas jacket, waterproof boots. He packed the lantern, the rods, the tackle box, a hand warmer, a thermos of black coffee, and the cooler. He left the truck on a gravel shoulder off the secondary road, hidden well enough behind a natural bend that no passing driver would give it a second look, and he walked the quarter-mile trail into the trees as the last of the daylight dissolved through the branches above him. The lake looked exactly as he remembered it. Still, cold, beautiful in the way that places are beautiful when no one else knows about them. He found his spot on the eastern bank, a flat shelf of rock that extended slightly over the water, giving him a clear angle to cast. He set the lantern to his left, pressed the rod stand into a soft crack in the rock, attached the bell, baited the hook, and sent the line out into the dark. For the first 40 minutes, nothing was wrong. The fish were active, which surprised him pleasantly. In the first hour he pulled 3 decent ones, a pair of pike and something he could not fully identify in the lantern light. He kept 2 in the cooler and returned the 3rd. The bell rang clean each time, the line pulled true, and the cold air smelled of pine resin and fresh water and nothing else. He was beginning to relax in the deep way that only this kind of night allowed. The particular quiet of being the only human being within miles of anything. He had poured his first cup of coffee and was lying back on his folded jacket, one eye on the rod tip, when he heard the sound. Soft. Behind him. Like weight settling carefully onto wet ground. He sat up and turned the lantern. Nothing. The bank behind him ran about 12 feet before meeting the tree line, and every inch of it was empty. A deer, he told himself. A fox. The forest was full of both, and neither one was anything to worry about. He settled back down. Then the breathing. Close. Too close. On the back of his neck, a slow, cold exhale, deliberate and unhurried, as though whatever was producing it had been there for some time and was simply deciding whether to announce itself. He spun around and swept the lantern in a full arc. Nothing. The bank. The trees. The cold air. His own equipment sitting exactly where he had placed it. He told himself, long drives do this. 18 hours behind the wheel, the hypnotic rhythm of the road, the interrupted sleep, the senses begin to fabricate. The brain starts editing noise into shapes. It was well documented, and he had experienced mild versions of it before, usually around hour 14. He breathed. He reset. The bell rang. But the line did not move. He watched it. The small brass bell at the tip of the rod was rocking with a faint, rhythmic tapping, as though a finger was touching it from below. But the line extended into the water slack and undisturbed. He checked the housing, tightened the clip, told himself wind deflection, atmospheric pressure, the settling of the rod stand against the rock. 2 minutes later it rang again. This time, from somewhere across the lake. An echo. The sound traveled along the water's surface and arrived at him from the opposite shore, faint and slightly wrong in pitch. Like a recording played one note too low. He stood and listened for a long time after it stopped. No other fisherman. No lantern light. No sound of a vehicle on the road behind the far tree line. Nothing that should have been capable of producing that sound. He sat back down. He did not want to leave yet. The rod gave a hard pull 20 minutes later, a real strike this time, the line slicing through the water at an angle, the bell ringing in sharp, urgent bursts. He grabbed the rod and began to reel. Whatever was on the line was heavy, significantly heavier than anything he had caught that night. He worked the tension carefully, letting the drag out slightly to keep from snapping the line, drawing it in slow and steady. The weight came toward him through the water. But it was not moving like a fish. It was moving like something being dragged. Like an object with no intention of its own being pulled reluctantly toward the surface. He reeled until the thing broke the water's surface and swung into the lantern light. It was hair. Not a single strand or a loose clump. A mass. Dark and wet and dense, matted into a shape that suggested it had once been a braid. Long, carefully kept, and then submerged in cold water long enough to come half undone. It hung from his hook with a weight that felt wrong for what it was. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he reached out and touched it. The cold went through his fingers and up his arm and settled somewhere near the base of his skull, and he pulled his hand back before he fully understood why. There was a word for the feeling that came with that contact, but he could not locate it at the time. He would find it later. Much later. After the night was over. He knocked the hair free with the rod tip and watched it fall back into the water. It did not sink like debris. It sank like something returning. And then the bubbles began. Not scattered. Not random. A line of them, rising from the bottom in a clean, deliberate progression, moving from the center of the lake toward the bank where he stood. Steady. Purposeful. He backed up. The bubbles reached the shallows and stopped. The surface went smooth. Completely smooth. Not a ripple. He was standing very still now. The lantern felt like it was generating less light than it had before, though he knew that was not possible. He stood and breathed and felt, for the first time, the specific quality of the silence around him. Not the comfortable silence of an empty lake at midnight. Something else. A silence that had an orientation. that was facing him. He felt it before he saw it, the shift in his chest, the involuntary tightening at the base of the throat, the primitive thing inside him that predates language and does not need evidence to know when it is being watched. He looked down. The mud at the edge of the bank was soft. He had barely noticed it when he arrived. Now, in the lantern light, he could see impressions in it that were not his. Long, bare, closely spaced, circling his camp at a distance of perhaps 8 feet. Not arriving from the lake. Not departing into the tree line. Just circling. As though whatever had made them had been moving around him, quietly, for quite some time. His heavy waterproof boots had left deep, treaded prints at the water's edge. These were different. Narrower. Pressed shallower. Not because they were lighter but because the weight had been distributed differently. As though the thing that made them was not quite fully in contact with the ground. He began packing his equipment. He was reaching for the cooler handle when the surface of the water moved. Not wind. The movement started from below. A slow upward displacement, the water pulling slightly back from the bank as something rose toward the surface. And then a shape broke the waterline. Long black, curving upward in a slow arc. Hair. The same mass of hair, or another one, ascending through the dark water as though something beneath it was lifting its head. The face was not visible. Just the hair, fanned and spreading on the water's surface. Just the suggestion of a shape underneath it. Just the slow, unhurried pace of its rising. He ran. The trail back to the road was not the same. He understood this with a disorienting certainty that arrived about 30 seconds into his run. The ground was softer here than it had been on the way in, the trees closer together, the arrangement of shadows wrong in ways he could not name. He did not stop. He told himself it was the dark. That panic was rewriting the landscape. He kept moving. Then the sound behind him. Footsteps. Bare and unhurried, stepping in the same rhythm as his own. When he stopped, they stopped. When he moved, they moved. He swept the lantern behind him twice and found nothing but tree trunks and darkness and his own ragged breathing. He ran again. Dropped one of the rods. Left it. Then the lights of the road appeared through the trees, a dim orange wash in the distance, the distant pulse of a reflector post, and he came out of the forest onto the gravel shoulder with his heart detonating in his chest and every muscle in his body vibrating at a frequency he did not recognize. The truck was where he had left it. He saw the handprints before he reached the door. They covered the driver's side panel from the handle down. Long, wet, clearly articulated. The fingers were slightly elongated, or the water had spread them that way, he could not be certain. They were fresh. The moisture had not yet begun to evaporate in the cold air. He stood and looked at them in the lantern light and then walked around to the passenger side, where more marks traced the lower panel, lower than a standing adult would naturally reach. As though whatever had made them had been crouching, or had come from below. He climbed into the cab, locked the doors, sat in the driver's seat without moving for approximately 15 seconds. Then he turned on the overhead light and looked at the bunk. The mattress held a single long depression, dark, wet, still glistening, in the center of the sleeping surface. And at the edge of it, pressed into the fabric as though it had been placed rather than shed, were several long strands of black hair. The bunk had been empty when he left. He had not touched it since returning. He was certain of this. He started the truck and drove. Tried to drive. The tachograph interrupted him 11 minutes later with an automated warning. His mandatory rest period was not yet legally complete, and the system would log a compliance violation if he continued. He had no choice. He pulled over on the shoulder of the highway. In the 22 minutes that followed, he heard knocking on the driver's door. 2 short knocks, evenly spaced. He heard a sound from the far side of the cab. He heard, from the bunk area, the faint and unmistakable ring of a fishing bell, and confirmed, with his hand in his jacket pocket, that the bell was still there, still with him, had never left. Then the truck's horn began to sound. Not a blast. A sustained, steady press, the kind a person produces when they lean their weight against the steering wheel. He was outside the cab at the time, having exited through the passenger door to investigate a hard impact from the rear of the trailer. He came around the front of the truck at a run. The driver's door slammed shut as he reached it. Not pushed by wind. Pulled. From the inside. He stood with his hand on the door handle for a full 3 seconds before opening it. The cab was empty. He climbed in and locked the door and looked through the windshield, and she was standing there. In the headlights. She was tall and still and completely unhurried. Her hair was wet and hanging across her face in long dark sheets, and the parts of her face visible beneath it were the color and texture of something that had been submerged for a very long time. Swollen. Colorless. Asymmetrical in the way that suggests not injury but prolonged exposure to cold water, the slow rearrangement of what had once been a person. She was not moving. She was not threatening him in any active sense. She was simply present, looking at him through a curtain of wet hair with eyes that held no light and showed no recognition. He pressed the horn. She did not react immediately. Then, with a deliberateness that was somehow more disturbing than speed, she turned her head to the side, not away, just aside, and began to move off the road. There was nothing human in the way she moved. He put the truck in gear. He drove. He did not look in the mirror for the first 30 seconds, and when he finally did, she was there, behind the trailer, running. Not in the frantic, ungainly way of a human being at full sprint. In a smooth, weightless, perfectly upright lope that kept exact pace with a truck doing 50 kilometers an hour on a winding mountain road. The long hair streamed straight back. The arms barely moved. She ran with him for slightly over 2 minutes. Then she was gone. He reached the service area 14 minutes later and sat in the parking lot for a long time with the engine running. He never went back to that lake. He gave the fishing rods away the following month to a colleague who asked where he had gotten such good equipment. He did not explain. He simply handed them over and said he had decided to stop. He still drives long routes. He still crosses the stretch of road that passes through that part of the hills once or twice a year, because the freight contracts do not always offer alternatives. When he does, he keeps his eyes ahead and his speed consistent and the radio off so he can hear anything that needs to be heard. He says that the moment he cannot forget, the single image that returns to him most often in the half-space between waking and sleep, is not the face in the headlights. It is the hair on the fishing hook. The weight of it. The cold that traveled up through his fingers and lodged somewhere in his chest and has never entirely left. There is a kind of fear that the body understands before the mind catches up. A recognition that arrives in the skin before it forms a thought. We tend to dismiss it in hindsight, call it fatigue, call it darkness playing tricks, call it the ordinary strangeness of being alone in a place where human beings have no real business being. We reach for the rational explanation not because it is more convincing, but because it is more bearable. Marcus reached for it too. At every stage of that night, he offered himself an exit. An animal. Wind on water. Gas trapped in lake sediment. A trick of lantern light on waves. Each explanation held for a few minutes and then something took it away from him. There is something about standing water at night, the way it doubles everything, the way it holds whatever falls into it with a patience that outlasts understanding. Fishermen have always known that lakes are the wrong kind of mirror. That what they reflect is not always what is standing on the bank. Whatever was in that water knew he was there before he set his first line. Whatever it was patient. It let him catch his fish. It let him feel safe long enough to stay. That is the part one think about. Not the face in the headlights. Not the handprints on the cab door. The patience. The way it waited. The way it seemed to understand that a man alone in a dark and comfortable place will always find reasons to stay just a little longer. Some water is not for fishing. Some silence is not empty. Lock your doors tonight. Not because it will help, but because the alternative is leaving them open. This is After the Horror.